Hi, my name is Emily. I'm 28, living in a small apartment in a city I love, working a job that I fought hard to get, and finally feeling like I'm in control of my own life. It hasn't always been this way. Growing up, I was the girl who never seemed to be enough. Not smart enough, not beautiful enough, not ambitious enough according to my mother at least. I spent years trying to please her, trying to meet impossible standards that shifted every week. Until I learned the hard truth, I could never win in her eyes. But I thought I'd moved on. I had, or at least I thought I had. I was building my own life, surrounded by people who actually celebrated my successes instead of mocking my mistakes. And then one ordinary Thursday morning, everything came crashing back in the most absurd and humiliating way imaginable. I had just finished my morning coffee when the mail arrived. I usually toss the junk mail into the recycling, but one envelope caught my eye. It was heavier than usual, formal looking, and had my mother's handwriting across the front. There was something unsettling about the way it looked so official, like a legal notice or a bill from a hospital. My heart skipped a beat. A tiny warning bell I should have listened to. Curiosity and maybe a little dread made me tear it open. And there it was, a single sheet of paper neatly typed with a title that made my stomach drop. $347,000. Cost of raising a failure. I stared at the numbers, convinced that I was hallucinating. A bill from my mother. For my life. I read the title again and again. My eyes flicked down the page, and that's when the itemized charges hit me like a sucker punch. There were detailed expenses for every misstep she had ever criticized me for. Missed deadlines, failed relationships, wasted college tuition, broken promises, and even emotional damage she claimed I caused her by not living up to her expectations. I laughed at first. I mean, it had to be a joke, right? Who actually does this? But the laugh caught in my throat when I realized the handwriting at the bottom of the signature was hers. My mother had literally sent me a bill for living my life. I sat down, gripping the edge of the table like it would anchor me to reality. My first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by a tidal wave of anger and humiliation. I felt like a character in a nightmare someone else was watching. One of those twisted stories where the parent punishes the child for daring to exist. Every word on that page felt like a punch, not just in my stomach, but in my self-esteem, my independence, everything I had worked so hard to build. I thought about calling my friends, but even they might not understand the depth of absurdity and cruelty here. Who could? You hear about toxic parents. Sure. But a $347,000 invoice labeled failure? That was a new level. My hand trembled as I held the paper. Was this an attempt at humor, as she later claimed? A lesson? Or just pure malice disguised as accounting? I remember sitting there for what felt like hours, staring at the numbers, imagining them being physically stamped on my chest. I wanted to tear it up, burn it, flush it down the toilet, but I couldn't. There was something about keeping it, holding it, staring at it, that felt important, like keeping a trophy of the most ridiculous thing I had ever been subjected to. And then, almost as a whisper to myself, I realized something. I couldn't let this go. Not because I wanted to argue the math, but because I couldn't let her rewrite my life story into a ledger of failures. Somehow, somewhere deep inside, a spark ignited. This wasn't just a bill, it was a challenge. And I wasn't going to let it define me. I looked at that envelope again and promised myself something. I hadn't promised anyone in years. I wasn't going to crumble. I was going to fight back. I wish I could say the $347,000 bill came as a complete shock. In truth, it was just the latest, most ridiculous chapter in a story that had started long before I could even talk properly. My childhood wasn't just difficult, it was a constant treadmill of criticism and disappointment, run by my mother. She had this talent for turning everything I did into a failure. A good grade. You only got that because it was easy. A drawing I made. My cousin could have done better at your age. Okay, compliment from a teacher. They're just being polite. Nothing was ever enough. My father was. Well, he existed. He was quiet, often avoiding conflict, nodding along as my mother criticized me. He seemed to believe that as long as he didn't intervene, nothing catastrophic would happen. He didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see, how those words cut into me. And my grandmother. She was supposed to be my safe place, my comfort, the one who would defend me. But she had her own way of hurting me too. Not openly, not with shouting, but with cold cutting remarks that lingered longer than my mother's yelling ever did. She's always been a little disappointing. My grandmother would murmur when my mother wasn't around, as if she were confirming my guilt even in her absence. I can remember my 8th birthday like it was yesterday. I had begged for a simple party, just a few friends and some cake. Instead, my mother critiqued every detail. The balloons weren't the right color. My dress was too bright. My friends weren't interesting enough. By the time the day ended, I had learned a valuable lesson: happiness, even on your birthday, could be measured and found lacking. And somehow, it was all my fault. School didn't offer any relief. I was careful, studious, trying desperately to prove myself. I joined clubs, volunteered, got decent grades, but every achievement was met with either indifference or an explanation of how I could have done better. "You only got that award because nobody else tried," she said once, and I believed her. Every failure she claimed I had was internalized, seared into my identity. By the time I was a teenager, I was afraid to even try new things. It wasn't that I didn't want to succeed. It was that I had learned that success didn't matter in the eyes of the people whose opinions should have meant the most. And then there was my grandmother. People would see her as sweet and nurturing, but I knew the other side. She could be cruel without raising her voice. One afternoon, I came home from school proudly waving an A+ on a difficult exam. My grandmother looked at it, smiled faintly, and said, "Good. I just hope your next one isn't a fluke." That tiny comment lodged itself in my mind, festering. Even when my mother wasn't criticizing me, someone else in my family reminded me that I wasn't enough. I spent years trying to please both of them, walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate what words or actions might earn a smile, a nod, or a rare compliment. I became hyper-aware of every mistake, every small imperfection, internalizing their judgment until it was like a second skin. I tried to escape by doing everything right in school, socially, even professionally later. But no matter what I achieved, I never felt free. I was always preparing for the next critique, the next blow disguised as guidance. And now, the $347,000 bill landed on my desk like a physical embodiment of everything I had been running from my whole life. It wasn't just numbers on paper. It was a crystallization of years of insults, manipulation, and emotional abuse. I realized suddenly that this bill was the ultimate judgment, proof, according to my mother, that I had failed in her eyes. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let it define me. I wasn't 8 years old anymore. I wasn't powerless. That paper, absurd as it was, became a challenge I could accept not as a failure, but as the beginning of my fight back. And deep down, a small, dangerous spark ignited. The idea that maybe, just maybe, I could turn all that toxicity back on them. I stared at that $347,000 bill for what felt like hours. I could barely process it. My mother had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just the absurdity of the number, the way she had itemized every failure in my life. It was the message underneath it all, that my existence, my mistakes, and even my triumphs were all fodder for her judgment. That I had somehow cost her something: money, time, emotional energy, just by being me. Finally, picked up my phone and dialed her number. My hands shook as it rang. I wanted answers. I wanted her to explain why she had sent me a bill for living my life. But mostly, I wanted to feel human again, to hear her say even once that she was proud of me. "Hello?" Her voice was crisp, controlled, almost cheerful. "Mom," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "We need to talk about this. This bill you sent me." There was a pause. A quiet, calculated pause. "Oh, that," she said finally, as if I had picked up the wrong piece of mail. "It's a lesson, Emily. A little reality check. You need to understand the cost of your choices. I blinked. I couldn't even process the words. A lesson. She had sent me a 3-100-40-7-1000 bill labeled cost of raising a failure. And now she was acting like this was some kind of educational exercise. Are you serious? I asked, my voice rising. This isn't a joke. You sent me a bill for living my life. For being your daughter. She laughed. Not a warm laugh, not even a sarcastic one. It was a light, dismissive chuckle that made my blood boil. Oh, Emily, you always take things so seriously. It's just numbers. A bit of fun. A reminder. You need to understand responsibility. You're 28 and still making the same mistakes you made when you were 12. It's time to face reality. I could feel my face burning with a mixture of anger and shame. Her words weren't just absurd, they were cutting, cruel, and calculated. Every ounce of self-respect I had spent years building suddenly felt threatened, as if it could be erased by the very person who was supposed to protect me. I can't believe you. I whispered, more to myself than to her. I can't believe this is coming from you, from my own mother. Well, she said, the amusement in her voice undeniable. Believe it. You owe me, Emily. You've cost me everything. It's time you recognize that. I slammed the phone down. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to do a million things, but mostly I just sat there, trembling, staring at the bill on the table. My mother had turned my life into a ledger. And now she was expecting me to feel guilty. I called my best friend, Sarah. I had to tell someone. I needed validation, someone to say, no, you're not crazy. No, this isn't normal. Are you kidding me? Sarah said when I read parts of the bill to her. Emily, that's insane. That's illegal in some states. I know, I said, my voice cracking. I don't even know how to deal with this. I feel humiliated, angry, sick to my stomach. And I don't know if I should laugh or cry. Just definitely not pay it, she said firmly. And honestly, you need to start thinking about how to protect yourself from her, because this isn't just a one-time thing. She's trying to control you through guilt. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. Control. That's what this was really about. Not a lesson, not a joke. Control. My mother had always tried to shape my life, dictate my choices, and now, even at 28, she was attempting the same thing through financial intimidation. I felt a strange clarity wash over me. For the first time, I realized something crucial. I didn't have to play her game. I didn't have to accept her narrative of me as a failure. I didn't have to let her control my emotions or my life anymore. But one thing was also clear. I couldn't ignore this. I couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. Something had to be done. And deep down beneath the hurt and humiliation, a spark ignited one I had been suppressing for years. If she wanted to treat me like a failure, maybe it was time I showed her exactly who had the power in this story. After the phone call with my mother, I was shaking. My hands still felt numb, my chest heavy with anger and disbelief. I needed anyone to understand me, to tell me I wasn't crazy, to tell me I wasn't a failure. The first person who came to mind was my grandmother. She had always been the one person I thought might see the good in me. Even when my mother couldn't, I dialed her number, heart hammering in my chest. I imagined her soothing voice, the warmth of her presence, the quiet reassurance I used to cling to as a kid. Maybe she would scold my mother. Maybe she would say something comforting. I clung to the hope that she would remind me that I had value, that I had worth independent of my mother's relentless judgment. Grandma. My voice sounded small, fragile, even to me. Emily, she said, her voice calm, a little too calm. Is something wrong? I took a shaky breath. It's Mom. She sent me a bill, a real bill, Grandma, for $347,000. She called it the cost of raising a failure. And my words faltered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted someone to tell me it wasn't true. There was a pause. And then, instead of comfort, came a soft, almost regretful sigh. Emily, maybe she's right. I froze. What do you mean, Grandma? How could you say that? Are you siding with her? I'm not siding with her, honey, she said, her voice measured, almost clinical. But you have to admit, you could have done better in certain areas. We've all seen it. My stomach twisted. A wave of betrayal slammed into me harder than any of my mother's words ever had. I had expected at least a shred of support, a whisper of empathy, but instead, the person I trusted most after my mother had just validated the cruelty. My grandmother, who had held me as a child when I cried at night, who had once told me I was smart and capable. She was now telling me I had failed. I don't understand, I whispered, my throat tight. I just wanted someone to believe in me even a little. She sighed again, this time heavier, almost as if she were weighing her words carefully. Emily, life is hard. People are hard. You can't expect everyone to celebrate you all the time. Maybe this is the wake-up call you need. I felt something inside me break, and yet, in that brokenness, a new sense of clarity began to form. It was like a door had slammed shut, but another had creaked open. I realized then that the toxicity in my family wasn't going to disappear. My mother and grandmother were who they were. And they weren't going to change. The anger that had been simmering under the surface for years now boiled over. I wasn't just angry at my mother anymore. I was angry at the entire system that had taught me that I was never enough. At the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, only to remind me constantly of my shortcomings. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, and stared at the wall. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I could feel the weight of decades of criticism pressing down on me. And yet, I also felt a spark of something dangerous, something powerful. If they wanted to label me a failure, if they wanted to try to control my life through shame and guilt, then I realized something crucial. I didn't have to let them. I didn't have to crumble. I didn't have to apologize for existing. And maybe, just maybe, I could turn this entire nightmare into something I could control for the first time. I felt like I had a plan forming. Not impulsive, not reckless, careful, deliberate. And just enough to remind my mother and grandmother that I was not and never had been their failure. They had underestimated me for decades, and now they were about to learn exactly what that meant. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them define my story anymore. And if they wanted to wage a war through guilt and humiliation, I was ready to fight back. That day, sitting alone in my small apartment, I made a promise to myself I would reclaim my life, my dignity, and my power. And when I was done, they would finally see me not as a failure, but as someone they could never control again. After my grandmother's crushing response, I felt a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, disbelief, but beneath it all, a spark of determination started to burn. For the first time in years, I realized that if I didn't take control of this situation, it would continue to define me. My mother's $347,000 bill wasn't just absurd, it was a declaration of war. And I suddenly understood that I needed to respond, but carefully. Recklessly lashing out wouldn't help. I had to plan, strategize, and reclaim my power in a way they would never anticipate. I started by documenting everything. Not just the bill, not just the insults, but decades of patterns, every comment. Every snide remark, every subtle humiliation. I opened a folder on my laptop and started typing. There were moments from my childhood. My 8th birthday party ruined by criticism. The time my mother told me my report card was disappointing even though I had gotten straight A's. My grandmother's backhanded comments that made me feel guilty for even being happy. I included things from my adult life too. Times my mother had tried to manipulate me through guilt over career choices, personal relationships, or financial decisions. Seeing it all compiled in one place made me shiver. It was long, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but also strangely empowering. Next, I consulted friends and mentors I trusted, carefully selecting people who had experience with legal matters or family disputes. I didn't want to act blindly. I wanted to understand my rights, what boundaries I could set, and how to protect myself while remaining calm and composed. One friend, a lawyer, reminded me gently, "Emily, you don't have to accept their definition of failure. And remember, there are ways to assert yourself legally and emotionally without losing yourself in anger." Those words resonated deeply. I realized revenge didn't have to be reckless. It could be smart, strategic, satisfying. I also spent time reflecting on my own life, the things I had accomplished despite the constant criticism and the lack of support. I reminded myself that I was living independently, paying my own bills, building a career, and forming relationships that were healthy and supportive. I had survived their emotional games, and I had thrived. And now I knew I could use that survival to fuel a carefully measured response. I made a plan step by step. First, I would assert boundaries with my mother. No more unsolicited lessons about money, life choices, or failure. I would respond to any communication with calm, reasoned statements that reflected facts, not emotions. Second, I would document everything moving forward, keeping a record of any attempts to intimidate, belittle, or manipulate me. Third, I would prepare a public response. Not in anger, but in a way that clearly showcased the absurdity of her actions while protecting myself legally at the same time. I allowed myself to feel the anger fully. I cried sometimes, screamed into pillows, even paced around my apartment. It was cathartic, necessary. But I never let it cloud my judgment. Every step I took, every note I wrote, every plan I made was grounded in clarity. I was turning their weapons, the guilt, the humiliation, the judgment back on them, but on my terms. I also started thinking creatively. Maybe it wouldn't be a literal financial revenge. Maybe it would be social, emotional, or symbolic. I wanted my mother and grandmother to see that their attempts to control me, to define me as a failure, had failed spectacularly. I would take the narrative they tried to write and rewrite it entirely, not with malice, but with proof of my resilience, intelligence, and self-worth. By the end of the week, I had a folder filled with decades of evidence, a network of friends and mentors ready to support me, and a plan that combined strategy, boundaries, and public exposure. I felt lighter somehow, more in control than I had in years. The fire in me was no longer just anger, it was a tool, a weapon I could wield intelligently, sitting in my apartment that night, staring at the $347,000 bill lying innocently on the table. I whispered to myself, "You wanted to label me a failure? Fine, I'm not failing anymore, and soon. You're going to see that clearly." Was the moment I realized revenge doesn't have to be loud, reckless, or messy. It can be calculated, clever, and ultimately deeply satisfying. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the upper hand by the time I began executing my plan. The anger that had been simmering for weeks had transformed into something sharper, clearer purpose. This wasn't about yelling, crying, or giving into rage. This was about strategy. For years, my mother and grandmother had defined me as a failure, and for years, I had silently endured it. Now it was my turn to take control. The first step was subtle but effective. I started with small public truths, sharing stories online about parental expectations, emotional manipulation, and the absurdity of measuring love in dollars. I didn't name names at first. I wanted the focus on the behavior, not the drama. The posts were relatable, raw, and honest. People began commenting, sharing similar experiences, and the stories started to gain traction. I realized how many people had felt the same shame, humiliation, and guilt that my mother had tried to pin on me. Meanwhile, I continued documenting every interaction, every attempt my mother made to gaslight or control me. I kept calm, composed, and meticulous. Every text, every email, every voicemail became evidence. And then I made my move. I posted the story about the $347,000 bill. I told it with humor, honesty, and a touch of incredulity, because let's be honest, it was unbelievable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were outraged, incredulous, and supportive. Messages poured in from strangers and friends alike, all echoing the same sentiment. No one should be treated like that. And certainly not by their own family. The reaction didn't stop at social media. Even in my small circle of friends and colleagues, the story spread like wildfire. My mother, who had always thrived on controlling narratives, found herself suddenly exposed. Her attempts to justify the bill, to label it as a lesson, were met with ridicule and disbelief. People who had once nodded politely at her criticisms now shook their heads in disbelief. Questioning the cruelty of such an act, grandmother, too, felt the impact. Suddenly, the person who had once whispered her judgments behind closed doors was confronted with a reality she couldn't ignore. The world saw her complicity. I could almost feel the discomfort radiating from her whenever I visited family gatherings after that. Her words, which once cut me to the core, now hung in the air, powerless against the truth. Through it all, I remained composed. I didn't lash out, I didn't beg for validation, and I didn't stoop to cruelty. Instead, I let the facts, the stories, and the truth speak for themselves. Every post, every comment, every conversation reinforced one undeniable message. I was not a failure, and their attempts to define me had failed spectacularly. The most satisfying moment came the day my mother tried to confront me in person. She looked frustrated, flustered, almost desperate. I listened calmly as she attempted to justify her actions, her words faltering under the weight of public opinion and the undeniable documentation I had amassed. I didn't need to raise my voice or fight back. The evidence, combined with my composure, did all the work. For the first time, I watched as she realized that her control over me had evaporated. I felt a thrill unlike anything I had ever experienced. Years of criticism, humiliation, and manipulation had prepared me for this moment. I was no longer the scared, anxious girl who tried desperately to meet impossible expectations. I was strong, empowered, and unshakable, sitting alone later that evening. I looked at the $347,000 bill one last time. I laughed a genuine, triumphant laugh that had nothing to do with mockery and everything to do with liberation. That paper, once a symbol of shame and control, was now just a relic. A reminder of how far I had come and how much power I had reclaimed. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from judgment. Free from manipulation. Free from the toxic definitions that had haunted me for decades. And in that freedom, I realized something profound. Revenge isn't about hurting others. It's about reclaiming your power, rewriting your story, and proving to yourself that no one, not even your own family, can define your worth. I had won, and it felt incredible. After my story went public and the $347,000 bill had been exposed to friends, family, and social media, the air around my life changed completely. For weeks, I walked around with a mix of exhilaration and tension. I had reclaimed my power, but with that victory came consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. The first ripple came from my mother. I noticed it immediately. Her calls became fewer, and when she did call, her voice lacked its usual arrogance. She tried a few attempts at manipulation. Subtle digs veiled as concern, but it was clear she was losing her grip. Every time she tried to justify herself, I stayed calm, polite, and factual. No yelling, no pleading, just the truth and the confidence that came with it, and it worked. Her words, once sharp and piercing, now sounded hollow and desperate. Grandmother's reaction was even more striking. She had always been the quiet enforcer of my mother's judgments. It's the one who whispered criticisms when she thought I wasn't listening. But the moment my story went viral, she found herself exposed too. Family gatherings became awkward. She would glance at me nervously, as if expecting judgment, only to realize it was her turn to feel the weight of accountability. I could see the embarrassment etched on her face, the way her eyes darted, searching for allies that weren't there. She had underestimated me for years, and now she was confronted with the undeniable reality. I was no longer a passive target. Extended family. Members began reaching out to me privately. Some offered support, expressing disbelief at my mother's actions and admiration for how I handled everything. Others, loyal to my mother, criticized me, calling me ungrateful or disrespectful. It was a strange mix of validation and tension. I realized that taking a stand always comes with polarizing reactions. And that's a lesson in itself. The most profound change, however, was internal. I had always carried the weight of their criticism in my chest, a constant pressure that dictated my decisions, my emotions, and even my self-worth. But now, that weight was gone. I felt lighter, freer, and more confident than I ever had before. Every step I took, every decision I made was guided by my own judgment, not theirs. I had finally reclaimed my narrative. Still, the fallout wasn't without pain. Family bonds that had once existed, even if strained, were fractured. My mother was furious, my grandmother embarrassed, and my father silent. I felt a twinge of sadness for the relationships I had wanted, the family unity I had longed for. But I also understood that some connections are toxic beyond repair. Self-preservation sometimes means walking away. Friends and colleagues became my new support system, a chosen family of people who validated my experiences and encouraged my growth. Their belief in me reinforced the truth I had always struggled to see. My worth wasn't determined by my mother's judgments or my grandmother's whispers. It was intrinsic, and no one could take it away. I also noticed an interesting side effect. My own confidence inspired others. Friends began sharing their experiences with toxic parents, emboldened by my story. People reached out to thank me for shining a light on something that had been hidden in shame. The power of reclaiming my story extended far beyond my own life. One night, sitting in my apartment, I reflected on everything that had happened. The $347,000 bill, the phone calls, the public exposure, it all seemed surreal. I had faced the people who tried to define me, exposed their cruelty, and emerged stronger. The storm of fallout was intense, but I had survived it, and more importantly, I had thrived. I realized a vital truth: revenge, when measured and strategic, doesn't destroy others, it liberates you. My mother and grandmother might never fully understand the consequences of their actions, but that was no longer my concern. Their opinions were no longer a prison. I had built my freedom brick by brick, post by post, word by word. For the first time in my life, I could breathe without anxiety, without fear of judgment, and without the shadow of their expectations looming over me. I had won more than a battle. I had claimed my life. And even though some relationships were lost forever, the peace and empowerment I felt were worth every confrontation, every tear, and every sleepless night I had endured. I had learned something invaluable. The fallout of standing up for yourself can be messy, painful, and unpredictable, but it's far better than living a lifetime defined by others' cruelty. And as I looked forward, I knew this was just the beginning of truly living on my terms. For myself, and with no apologies. It took weeks, no months, to fully process everything that had happened. The $347,000 bill, the phone calls with my mother, my grandmother's crushing response. The public attention, it had all been a whirlwind, a storm of emotions and revelations. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe without guilt, without shame, without the heavy burden of trying to prove myself to people who would never see me as enough. I had rebuilt my life on my terms. My apartment, once just a small, functional space, had become my sanctuary. Every corner reminded me of my independence, my own decisions, my own successes, my own sense of peace. I started spending more time with people who uplifted me, friends who celebrated my wins and supported me in my struggles. I realized how powerful it was to surround yourself with those who see your worth without judgment. Financially, emotionally, and socially, I was thriving. I was working in a job I loved, one I had fought hard to secure without anyone else's approval. I was making choices about my life without consulting a mother who had labeled me a failure decades ago. I was learning to trust myself, to value my instincts. and to stop allowing the past to dictate my present. Even my mother and grandmother's reactions no longer held the same power over me. They were distant echoes, reminders of the toxicity I had escaped. My mother's attempts to manipulate or criticize were met with calm, measured boundaries. I had learned to disengage, to protect myself from words meant to wound. My grandmother's occasional comments, once devastating, now barely grazed me. They were no longer chains, just echoes. One afternoon, as I sat in my favorite coffee shop, I found myself reflecting on the journey. The absurdity of a $347,000 billet could have been humiliating beyond measure. But instead, it became a turning point. I realized that what had once been a source of shame was now my greatest lesson. It taught me to recognize manipulation, to value my worth, and to take control of my narrative. I also realized something profound about revenge. True revenge isn't about humiliation or making someone else suffer, about reclaiming your power and living fully. Every post, every boundary I set, every strategic move I made wasn't about hurting my mother or grandmother. It was about proving to myself that their definitions of failure were meaningless. The sweetest revenge was living my life unapologetically, joyfully, and without fear of judgment. I started volunteering with a local organization that helped young adults navigate toxic family relationships. Sharing my story and helping others see that they were not failures became a form of healing. Every time someone told me they felt empowered after hearing my experience, I felt a deeper sense of purpose. My pain, my anger, and my struggle were no longer just mine. They had become tools to help others reclaim their lives too. There were moments of sadness, of course. I missed what I had hoped family could be. The love, the support, the validation. But I had learned that those dreams, while beautiful, were not required for my happiness. I had created a new definition of family, one built on trust, care, and mutual respect. Sitting in my apartment one evening, looking out over the city skyline, I smiled. The $347,000 bill, once a symbol of shame and judgment, was now just a piece of paper, a relic of the past. I had transformed it into a symbol of my resilience. I had survived, fought back, and emerged stronger, wiser, and freer than I had ever imagined possible. I whispered to myself, softly but firmly, I am not a failure. I never was, and I never will be. For the first time, I believed it. And with that belief came peace. The journey wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, about turning pain into power, betrayal into clarity, and judgment into freedom. I had finally stepped out of the shadows of my mother and grandmother's expectations and into my own light. And as I faced the future, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing, no bill, no criticism. No toxic word could ever take away the life I had fought so hard to claim. I was free. And it felt incredible.